This is lecture 3 in the Western intellectual political tradition. I'll call it our ecologic crisis, historic roots. 1967, a paper was published by Lynne White Jr. looked at what he called the historic roots of our ecological crisis. It was obvious in the 1960s, earlier works had been published, such as Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that we were in the midst of an emerging ecological crisis. There were hints, there were pointers, there were symptoms very, very much at work, even in the 1960s, that things were not right. As Hamlet would say, things are out of joint. We're obviously experiencing many decades later the acceleration of what was already, for those minimally aware, an emerging problem, in which now global warming is reflecting further implications of that in terms of the climate and on human living conditions and much else. But what Lynne White Jr. attempted to articulate in his 1967 argue, Lynne White Jr. was a great medieval historian at the time, was first of all acknowledging that there was an ecologic crisis, but also asking himself what were the roots of that particular crisis. Ideas do have consequences, and so some consequences play themselves out immediately. If we put our hand on a hot burner, we are immediately burned, so there's an immediate connection between choice and consequence. If we jump out of a 6-story building, there's likely to be damage to our body. Choice and consequence is immediate. Other situations, the consequence takes longer to play itself out from a variety of choices. The environmental issue is one amongst many. Now, there's been two broadly speaking traditions in terms of humans making sense of the environment and their relationship to the environment. No one can deny the fact we live in a physical world, and how humans interact with nature and nature with humans determines, in a sense, the future of what it means for humans to be living on this planet. And so, where did these ideas come from then? And given the fact this is course on Western intellectual political tradition, we're still in the 16th century, Lynne White suggests, and he was a medieval historian, that the West, particularly Western Christianity, which to some degree he suggests, perhaps he overgeneralizes, but there's some truth to it. Western Christianity is very much coming out of what we call a voluntarist tradition, a doing, a vita activa tradition, versus Eastern Christianity or Byzantine Christianity, which tends to have a little more of a contemplative heritage and is not as driven by the will and by doing and accomplishing and performing and reshaping the earth through technological means. And so between Western and Eastern Christianity, he suggests that Western Christianity, with its vita activa drive, its ambitiousness, its terms of thinking, in terms it must shape and form the world to its own desires. And there's certain legitimacy that comes out of that. And so within the West, and what Lynne White Jr. is going to suggest is, and this has caused quite a reaction in the 1967 article, he argued that the roots of the Western ecological crisis come from a certain reading in the West, because the West has been dominated by a certain understanding of Christianity, a certain reading of Genesis, in which God commanded men, women, to take dominion over the earth, to dominate, to shape. Now, whether this is a legitimate read of Genesis, of course, there's been many rebuttals to Lynne White's particular read of how the West interpreted Genesis in terms of humans giving language to animals, dominating animals, shaping the earth, forming things to their own ends. But he will argue that Western Christianity, with a certain understanding of the relationship between God, humans, and nature, interpreted the future of the West in a way that humans had to use their skill, their will, their power, and there were certain reasons for that. There are two attitudes that, at the extreme end, that people have taken towards nature. One is a highly idealized nature, that nature is kind, it's gentle, blue sky, it brings us seasons, it's a place a person can rest in. Nature offers the symbols, the icons of seeing greater and deeper into the meaning of life. And so nature, in that sense, is a friend of humans, and so that people should interact in a symbiotic relationship with nature. It nurtures the human soul. It has nurtured literary people over the years. For religious people, they often use the multiple images of nature as windows and portals into the divine. And so in that sense, nature is seen as something that benefits humans, and in many ways it in no ways hurts or harms people. This is what we would call elements of the romantic or the idealist view of nature. And people who know themselves deeply are also the ones most in touch with nature at her best, or her kindness. That's the romantic view of nature, in which humans live in meaningful relationship with the natural world, and neither does the other hurt nor harm. The other is the realist view of nature, that in fact nature threatens humans. It's nature that brings fires, that destroys communities, destroys forests. It's nature that brings floods and tornadoes and tempests, that wipes out human communities and buildings. It's nature that brings viruses and bacterias, which we're witnessing obviously with COVID at the present. So nature is the threat to humans, and humans have to know how to deal with that threat and have power over nature, because if humans do not have power over nature, nature will control humanity. And so key thinkers, particularly when we think of then the historic roots of the ecological crisis, one of the great thinkers of the late 16th century, early 17th, was Francis Bacon, whose Novum Organum and his New Atlantis and works like this. He came from much more of a realist perspective, arguing that knowledge is power. And if we're powerless before nature, we will then become the victims of nature. So, now Bacon wasn't obviously opposed to the important role of theology and philosophy, but for him, what did philosophy and theology contribute to dealing with the threat of nature and what it could do to humans if they did not have the knowledge and the power to be able to stand up to nature and its destructive capacity for humans? And so in Bacon's thinking, and of course Locke will come after him, but many people in looking at the ecologic roots of and historic roots of our ecological crisis have ignored Bacon and his very significant contribution to understanding the role of science just coming from scientia, Latin, to know, but then linking up how we know with using what we know to control, to dominate nature, technique itself. And so Bacon's the Novum Organum, or the new organ, or the new way of knowing how humans should use the research, the knowledge they have in an empirical way, which of course certain elements of philosophy and certain elements of theology are not empirical in that sense, though the use of the senses to mine nature, to use nature, to know her secrets, and then to use those secrets against her so she will not hurt or harm. Interestingly enough, she is often used in Bacon's use, because if she was not properly controlled, she would dominate, and then the implications for humans. So in Bacon, you get key philosophical bringing together of science and power. And so, now obviously the use of science or knowledge can be used for much good. Scientists and engineers, they can build bridges, we build roads. People come to understand through the best use of science the nature of the galaxies, the planets. So science at one level, at a theoretical level, opens up secrets for people to understand how the stars in astronomy work. They understand how gravity works, how we can send planes outside of the rockets, outside of the Earth's gravitational field. And so science in that sense, it can be theoretical or it can be applied. But also science, when unpacking or unconcealing the secrets of the universe, can be deeply destructive as well. So we split the atom, and in understanding what happens when we split the atom, we can bring together science and technology and the military for warfare and the clash of states. We're living through the COVID crisis right now as we begin to explore, as scientists explore, how to deal with the COVID virus and how creating antibodies to that virus, how we no more remain the victims of a form of nature, but we now have the power through vaccines to resist, to end that particular virus. And so what you get in Bacon, he looks at the role of knowledge, but not only just knowledge in terms of looking at the universe and looking at the sciences, physics, chemistry, whatever, biology, and what humans have learned from these hard sciences. Obviously, certain forms of science also go and attempt to explore where did all these things come to be, how did they unfold, what's the age and the dating of all. At a certain point, one enters the realm of some empirical data and speculation, because science is as much an art form as it is an empirical form when it gets into the bigger questions beyond obvious, immediate empirical investigations. But when things are asked about the origins and times and dating, this is where science brings together both art, speculation, and empiricism. And so, same with weather conditions. Science can to some degree predict, but then there's also the ambiguity and uncertainty of what weather does and how people prepare for it. Again, weather conditions can have huge impact on humans. Nature, human, humans, nature. There is this ongoing tension. And so in Bacon, it's not as fully developed in Locke, but in terms of the historic roots of our ecological crisis, if we take the position that nature is the threat to our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Obviously, in political thought, you can have humans and humans in their interaction, and depending on how people interpret that, humans can be a threat to other humans in terms of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And as a result, different political ideologies emerged by the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And often when we look at the history of Western intellectual political thought, that's what gets focused on a little more, the human dynamics and what political system best facilitates liberty, choice, equality, conscience, individuality. And there's also the theological element of that as well. What's the relationship of how people interpret ultimate reality for interpersonal, penultimate issues? But there's also not only the horizontal political, intellectual aspect between humans, there's also humans collectively in our relationship to nature itself. And so nature, as I mentioned earlier, certainly in the late Middle Ages, Lynne White Jr, as I mentioned earlier, was a medieval historian. These people knew the Black Death, they knew the plague, they understood famine, they understood earthquakes, they understood devastations of nature either externally or internally in terms of diseases. And so when nature had the power over humans, this then led to the raising of the questions: how do humans prevent themselves from being victimized again and again by the violent, aggressive nature of nature itself? And out of this way of thinking, very empirical, very real, developed the idea in the West that unless humans take it into their own hands and see that unless they dominate and control nature, which is done through a merging of science, knowledge, and the application of science and technique, nature would again and again have the upper hand, and humans would again and again be the ones who suffered as a result of this. And so in the 16th, 17th century, this is becoming increasingly a substantive issue, which is going to play itself out over the centuries, that more and more humans took the position, unless we dominate nature, nature dominates us, to increasingly exploiting nature, polluting nature with varieties of pesticides and testing bombings and nuclear fission and nuclear bombs in water and on land in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that science in the service of the state and military not only served to keep nature at a distance, but also other political opponents at nature. We're living in a period of time in which the Baconian understanding of humans' need to dominate nature has got to the point where a boomerang effect is occurring, in which nature, after being battered, bruised, and beaten, is responding very much to humans, and we're now beginning to feel once again the impact of that. Now, if you start from the Baconian notion that we just need to have more knowledge so we can have greater power, so we can solve our environmental crisis, perhaps much can be learned from the romantic and the idealist wing of this in terms of what is the good that particular tradition. Now, Lynne White Jr. ends his controversial essay by pointing out that St. Francis of Assisi perhaps could be seen as a patron saint with his brother, sun, sister, moon, the relationship to the animal kingdom, in a sense an early forerunner of animal rights, key figure in that. There have also been many others who came along and argued that Lynne White's analysis, blaming a certain read of Genesis on the ecological crisis, was a misread. In fact, that to have dominion is to be a steward, to care for the physical world, just as proper parents care for the children, the household, and so that it is long-term sustainable development. So in the Hebrew translation, when that's properly understood, dominion does not mean domination and control and abuse and polluting and exploiting. That's hardly what the Genesis account is about. It's to care for the world so there'll be long-term sustainability, in which the relationship of humanity and nature is once more much more symbiotic, without being naive on the one hand, but also slipping into the sheer use of power for economic profit and greater affluence and prosperity, and the price that is paid for that. I might just end by mentioning, which I initiated previous lecture, which was much more a theological one between Erasmus and Luther. 16th century, there was also the movement of the mystics, and so within this period of time, both within the Roman Catholic Church, you had on the one hand the rise of the Jesuit order and Ignatius, which attempted, they were sort of the shock troops of the Roman Catholic tradition, Tridentine Catholicism, which tried to very much was at the forefront of defending a form of Catholicism which opposed Protestantism. But there are also the mystics in the Roman Catholic Church, like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, who in an age of external engagement, of theological clashes between forms of Christianity, they wanted to go deeper into the actual meaning of Christianity and the inner experience of Christianity and the transformative nature of Christianity. And so Teresa of Avila compared the human soul to a mansion, and she looked at the many different rooms within the mansion of the soul. And for her, the issue was, why are there certain rooms in our soul that we close off? We don't go into. We lock the door and say, no admittance. We shut down shutters in the windows of our soul. And as a result, the breeze of eternity does not blow through those shutters. What are those reasons we shrink as human beings? Why do we become cynical and skeptical? Why do we become ideological? And so there are, on the one hand, all these external issues that people have to face, whether in this period of time, the rise of science and the Baconian method, the clash between various versions of Christianity. But there were the contemplatives and the mystics also at this period of time, which were asking deeper questions about human experience. And John of the Cross, his brilliant works, Living Flames of Love, and how the difference between the ego and the self and those elements of us that have to be burned so that our true self will emerge, parts of us that must be pruned so the trunk and the fruit of our tree may truly blossom and bear much fruit. And so within this heated period of time, there were also women and men like Teresa and John. Sadly, so like Erasmus himself, Erasmus was put on the index, and interesting, the early Jesuits, many of them, not all of them, the relationship between the Jesuits and Erasmus is an interesting one, in which many of them initially were interested, but then when he gets put on the index, they were hesitant to be backers of Erasmus. So when I think of the Catholic Church, even of Trent, it was a highly complex phenomena, anywhere from the Spanish Inquisitions that were going on to women and men like Teresa, like John of the Cross, like Erasmus, who were dissidents within the Roman Catholic tradition, and some of the early Jesuits themselves, as Spain and Portugal was going to what was called the New World, in many ways an old world. There were those who took the position that Spanish Catholicism was the only way of understanding meaningful faith, and as they encountered primitive peoples as they saw it, First Nations people or Aboriginal people, they had to be converted from their pagan and primitive ways. There were other Jesuits, in fact, that took the position that, in fact, these Aboriginal traditions had great insight, and so the tensions within the Jesuits, the tensions within the Roman Catholic Church were very much at the fore at this period of time. And so the danger when we think sometimes periods of history, we can freeze them into homogeneous blocks, which no period of history can be that done. Most periods of history are highly polyphonic. There's tensions, there's clashes going on. And so we can also see the roots of the counter-ecological issue within elements of the Carmelite order, of which John of the Cross and Teresa were a part. And so there is this movement from Francis and Clare up to Teresa and John of the Cross. Certainly in Erasmus you can see a different understanding of the relationship of humans to nature than you would see in Bacon or Locke. And so when we look at the roots, the historic roots of the ecological crisis, is that this is why ideas are very important, because ideas do have consequences, and as certain ideas come to dominate, there's going to be material, empirical implications of that. When other ideas are subordinated, the consequences of where those ideas will lead are not given free play, And there's implications of that for culture, for society, for human communities, and much else. So anyway, to sum, Lynne White's 1967 article, The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, they certainly go back into periods of the medieval era, but in terms of a sophisticated articulation of the relationship of humans to nature. Bacon's work in the Novum Organum, his idea of the new Atlantis, that somehow science was going to bring in the new utopia in some ways, can be read as a counter to Thomas More's utopia. And to compare Thomas More and Bacon would be very important in terms of 16th, 17th centuries understanding of the relationships of human to nature. And so these are key thinkers, and how we are the heirs, because we are all, what Heidegger says, live in a state of thrownness. We have been thrown into a period of time in which we are living with the consequences of those who have thought in a certain way in the past, and then the consequences of that thinking, and then we have to make sense of that in our global crisis we're living with today, which is going to continue to accelerate. Hence, to get a sense and feel of how the 16th, 17th century are not only a center of theological issues, religious issues, but also the roots in many ways of the ecological crisis we face today.